He walked to the gate not to be saluted, not to be thanked, but simply to leave behind the weight he had carried for half a century. They laughed at him, mocked his age, called him confused. What they didn't know was that the man they turned away had once faced a wall of bullets so others could live. What they didn't know was that one of those lives was now a four-star general. And what happened next? It silenced a base, humbled two generations, and reminded the world that honor doesn't fade. It waits to be remembered. This is the story of Samuel Granger, the forgotten hero who didn't ask to be seen, but finally was. Stay with us, because the quietest knock may carry the loudest truth. Go home, old man. Nobody here wants your junk. That's what they told him, right there at the gate, the very same gate guarding the land he had once bled to protect. They didn't know who he was, didn't care to ask. Just waved him off like he was nothing more than a stubborn ghost from some forgotten war. He didn't argue, didn't raise his voice, just pulled the folded flag a little closer to his chest. A silent gesture, unseen by most. He turned away quietly, unnoticed by the country he had once served with everything he had. The guards laughed. A few people nearby whispered things under their breath. Maybe he's confused. Poor guy. They didn't understand. What they didn't see was the man who once crawled through jungle mud, bullets slicing through the air, to drag 17 of his brothers to safety. They'd never even heard of the place where he became more than a soldier. He became a lifeline. But 3 hours later, that gate, the same one that dismissed him, was silent. A black SUV rolled to a stop outside his home, its license plate gleaming with 4 stars. Inside, the past had returned in full regalia. And the soldiers who had sneered at him earlier, now they stood stiffly at attention, eyes locked straight ahead, trembling. Everything was about to change. The sun hadn't yet risen above the hills when Samuel "Sam" Granger stirred in his creaky old bed. At 79, he didn't need an alarm clock anymore. His body still ticked like it had back in the army, predictable, steady, as if he were still reporting for duty. Rain or shine, 5:30 a.m. sharp. Decades of habit don't fade easily. But these days it wasn't discipline that woke him. It was something deeper, a pull from within, a voice with no words. He swung his legs off the mattress and grimaced as his knees reminded him they weren't what they used to be. The floorboards groaned in the quiet, just as they had every morning since he'd bought the place in 1978. A modest little 2-bedroom home at the edge of Braddock Ridge, tucked deep into rural Pennsylvania. Time seemed to pass slower there. Nothing much changed, except for the silence beside him. Her scent still lingered faintly in the air, even after 6 years. Lavender and linen. Betty. She had been his compass when the world spun too fast. His anchor after the war, when everything else felt too loud or too distant. A photo of her in a soft summer dress sat on the nightstand, hands folded delicately in her lap, always smiling. Every morning Sam greeted her, a simple nod, a whisper. "Morning, Bets," he mumbled, brushing his thumb over the worn wooden frame. Down in the kitchen, one chipped mug sat beside the coffee maker, right where he'd left it the night before. Muscle memory took over as he prepared his coffee. Grounds, water, just the right weight. He stood by the window watching the fog lift from the golden fields stretching beyond his backyard. The landscape was familiar, calming. Across the gravel driveway sat his old 1971 Ford pickup. Rust decorated the fenders, but under the hood, she still ran like the day she was born. Every week, Sam popped the hood just to give his hands something to do. She didn't need fixing, but maybe he did. After breakfast, he opened the hall closet and reached for his coat, the one Betty had given him during the winter of '97. The left pocket still held a hand-stitched patch she'd sewn in herself. Inside always was the Bronze Star. He'd never displayed it, never talked about it. The ribbon had faded, but the metal still carried the same weight in his hand and in his heart. He stood there for a moment longer than usual, eyes drifting across the quiet corners of the house. A strange sensation began to rise in his chest, not pain, not fear, more like a murmur, something ancient and unspoken stirring back to life. Upstairs, tucked away carefully, lay the flag, folded and wrapped with reverence. He hadn't touched it in years. By 9 o'clock a.m., Sam was dressed. The Bronze Star, heavy in his coat pocket, and the folded American flag resting gently against his chest. He stepped outside, locked the door behind him, and started walking. He didn't take the truck. His steps were slow, but not weak. They were intentional. He wasn't just covering ground, he was walking through time. Each stride carried him across memories that the rest of the world had long forgotten. The maple trees lining the road had just begun to catch fire with autumn color. Leaves rustled in the wind as Sam moved forward, flag against his chest, metal shifting in his coat, a reminder that the past was still alive, even if nobody else saw it. For 30 years, he had lived just down the road from the Raven Hill Training Center. He had passed it hundreds of times. The place buzzed with new recruits now, young faces in sharp uniforms, the base gates guarded, drills echoing in the distance. But Sam had never once stepped foot beyond those fences. It had always felt closed off, like a world that didn't belong to him anymore. Something had changed, though. Something inside him had shifted. And today felt different. Sam stood just outside the diner's reach, his boots worn and creaking with each step over the brittle leaves scattered on the sidewalk. He never crossed the threshold. He told himself there was no need, but deep down the truth was far heavier. Somewhere along the line, he'd stopped believing he had the right. A squirrel darted across the cracked concrete, pausing just long enough to glance at him, as if trying to make sense of the old man standing there. Then it disappeared into a hedge. Sam's boots, those same scuffed black leather ones he'd worn every winter since Betty passed, crunched through the leaves, their earthy scent mingling with the cold air, bringing with it the weight of time. His mind, as it often did, drifted back to the oppressive heat of a jungle thick enough to choke on. Laos, 1969. A mission that should have been simple, just a reconnaissance patrol, no contact expected. They were supposed to move quietly, invisibly through the brush. But none of it mattered. The enemy had already been waiting. He still remembered the exact moment it started. The first sharp crack of gunfire slicing through the silence. The panic. The screams. The unmistakable hiss of bullets ripping through the canopy. And then, instinct took over. He'd acted before his mind could catch up. A friend had gone down beside him, bleeding out, and without thinking, Sam had grabbed the M60 and held the narrow bend in the trail, his only cover a few tangled vines and a prayer. 17 men lived because of what he did in those frantic minutes. 17. He never fully understood how or why, only that he had stayed when his body was begging him to flee. His arms had gone numb, his legs locked up. But he didn't move. A week later, a captain he never saw again shook his hand and handed him a medal. No speech, no parade, just a silent moment that tried to sum up a nightmare. Now the base was coming into view, its front gate rising like a solemn guardian of the past and future alike. Flags snapped in the wind, vivid against a dull gray sky. Sam could make out the thick concrete barriers, the booth, and two young soldiers stationed at the entrance. They hadn't noticed him yet. He slowed his pace. In his hands was a folded American flag, worn but carefully kept, the corners crisp and sharp. It wasn't just fabric. To Sam, it held everything, the weight of memory, of lives lost, of promises never spoken aloud but kept close on sleepless nights. He didn't know exactly what would happen once he got there, only that he had to do this before time ran out. He crossed the final street, stepped onto the sidewalk in front of the base, and paused. Inhaling deeply, he felt the wind catch at his coat. Then, with a quiet dignity earned through years of carrying things too heavy to name, Samuel Granger took a step forward. "Hold up there, sir." The voice came from the younger of the two guards. He was maybe 20, his hand resting casually on the strap of his rifle. "Cooper, does that gun?" His name patch read. Behind him, another private, Mendoza, leaned slightly out from the booth, a faint smirk tugging at his mouth. Sam stopped at the edge of the checkpoint, not stepping closer. He didn't reach for an ID he had none to offer. Instead, he lifted the folded flag slightly and said with a steady, gravel-worn voice, "My name's Samuel Granger. I came to donate this flag and this medal to the base. I served in Vietnam." Cooper narrowed his eyes, the beginnings of a skeptical smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Sir, this is an active military facility. You need clearance to be here." "I don't want to go in," Sam replied quietly. "I just want to leave these with someone who understands what they mean." He reached into his coat pocket and carefully pulled out a bronze star. The red, white, and blue ribbon fluttered slightly in the breeze. His hands trembled, not from age, but from something deeper, something tied to memories he rarely spoke of. Cooper didn't take a closer look. He didn't even lean in. He laughed. Know where you got that, but we're not running a museum, old man. From the booth, Mendoza snorted. You'd be amazed how many guys show up claiming they did something in Nam. Sam blinked, slowly. He hadn't come expecting praise, maybe not even warmth. But he hadn't expected this. Not laughter, not derision. I'm not claiming anything, he murmured, his voice barely audible. I just want to be sure these go to someone who will understand. You know what? I do understand. Cooper stepped closer, voice rising in authority. You're standing here holding a flag like it's a key that'll open the gates. But it doesn't. You're not cleared. You're not on the list. You don't belong here. People had begun to gather. Visitors from a tour grew up near the base. A man in a polo shirt leaned to whisper to his wife. She glanced at Sam, nodded slightly, and replied under her breath, probably has dementia. Sam's eyes dropped to the pavement. The wind tugged again at the flag, and instinctively he held it tighter. Not out of fear, out of reverence, out of love. Sam's legs trembled beneath him. The only thing holding him upright now was sheer will, and even that was slipping fast. Mendoza's voice crackled through the radio, calm and professional. Control, this is Gate. We've got a civilian disturbance. Elderly male, possibly unstable. Requesting instruction. The words hit Sam harder than he expected, not because they weren't true, but because they were spoken like a report, like he wasn't a person anymore. Just another odd incident to log. The sting wasn't just embarrassment, it was sharper than that. A deep, slicing humiliation that ran straight through him, clean and cold. He could feel their eyes, dozens of them, tourists in sun hats and sneakers, uniformed guards with mirrored sunglasses, children clutching plastic flags, watching without understanding. He thought of Betty, how she used to soothe the nightmares when they clawed their way back into his mind, how she'd squeeze his hand when words failed him, grounding him in the present when he drifted too far into the past. I just wanted to leave this in the right hands before I go, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, more to himself than anyone else. What was that? Asked Cooper, clearly not catching it. But Sam didn't repeat himself. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't try to explain. He simply nodded once to no one in particular, slid the metal object back into his pocket, turned slowly, and began to walk away. His steps were careful, deliberate, like each one was chosen, not taken. Yet every movement felt like a retreat, not from the guards or the gate, but from something deeper, something that couldn't be fenced in with chain link or concrete. Behind him, Cooper muttered, "Geez, the things you see on shift." Mendoza chuckled under his breath. Let him go. He probably won't even remember he was here. Sam didn't hear them, or maybe he did. Either way, he kept moving. The flag clutched tightly to his chest, his chin held as high as his pride would allow. The murmurs behind him, the gate, the guards, the low drone of curious voices, faded into nothing. The walk back felt longer. His legs moved with the same steady rhythm, but everything else had changed. Or maybe he had. The breeze, earlier a brisk autumn greeting, now sliced through his coat like ice. The trees, once vibrant in gold and crimson, now seemed drained of life, their brilliance muted by something unseen. When he reached his porch, he didn't go inside right away. Instead, he paused and gripped the railing. The flag remained pressed to his chest like a lifeline. A single dry leaf drifted down from the old maple tree and landed at his feet. He watched it spin, fall, and land without resistance. Inside the house, silence met him like an old friend, steady, familiar, unchanging. He placed the flag on the kitchen table next to Betty's photo, and for a long moment he didn't sit. He just stood there, staring down at the two anchors of his life. One, a face etched with warmth and quiet strength. The other, a folded piece of cloth that reminded him of why he'd made it home at all. Betty always knew what to say. When the dates came around, anniversaries of firefights, echoes of screams and heat and dust, she never asked for the details. She simply sat beside him, sometimes with a mug of tea, sometimes in total silence, always with love. Sam reached out and brushed his fingers along the edge of her picture frame. "I tried, Bets," he murmured. "I really tried." And then his knees buckled. Not from weakness, but from the sheer weight of it all. He sank slowly into the old recliner, letting his arms fall at his sides. The piece of metal in his coat pocket felt impossibly heavy now. He closed his eyes. The jungle came back. The dense, wet air, the terror that stuck in his throat, the blasts of gunfire and the screams that never seemed to end. And then that moment, that exact moment that haunted him always, when he stood up with the M60 and walked into a storm of bullets, not to be a hero, but because no one else was left to trade. He could still feel the weapon's crushing weight, still hear the shouted commands behind him, still remember the tremor in his arms as he held the line, just long enough for the others to crawl to safety. Then came the silence. He had never told anyone. Not the whole story, not even Betty. She only knew the aftermath. A soft knock stirred him from the memory. At first, he thought it was something inside his head, just another ghost from the past. But then it came again, louder this time. A firmer knock at the door. He opened his eyes. Silence again. Probably just the wind, he told himself. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that miles away a general was pacing in his office, haunted by a name that had been spoken in ridicule, but which carried 50 years of unspoken debt, guilt, and unshakable loyalty. Samuel Granger. And the next time someone knocked on that door, it wouldn't be the wind. It would be the military. Coming home. The hallways of the command wing pulsed with their usual rhythm, the rustle of papers, the cadence of boots thudding against polished tile, and clipped voices trading rapid reports. Behind the heavy oak door marked Commanding Officer, General Terrence Nolan stood silently by the window in his office, sipping cold coffee. Outside, cadets ran precision drills across a sun-baked field. His thoughts were still half occupied with a just-ended virtual briefing with Pentagon Logistics. Another routine check-in with nothing out of the ordinary. That changed the moment he heard it. Laughter. It floated faintly through the air vent from the common room down the hall. Normally, Nolan wouldn't spare a thought for whatever jokes the junior enlisted shared during their breaks. But something about this laughter felt off. Too pointed. Too cruel. His instincts, sharpened by decades of service, tensed. Then came the voice, young and smug. "You should have seen the guy," the soldier said, barely restraining his amusement. Private Cooper, though Nolan didn't recognize the name yet. Some old dude showed up waving a flag like it was some kind of golden ticket, said he fought in Nam and wanted to give us a medal. A sharp crack, the sound of pool balls breaking, echoed in the background, punctuating the mockery. Another voice joined in, likely Mendoza. Brought a folded flag too, looked like one of those sad little street preachers. I almost felt bad, but it was kind of funny. Then the laughter stopped, and a name dropped into the air like a dead weight. I think it was Granger or something. Samuel Granger. Nolan didn't hear anything after that. His body stiffened, his blood turned to ice. His mind snapped out of the present and into the jungle of Laos, 1969. A sweltering furnace of heat, mud, and fear. The gunfire, the ambush, the K. And one young man who refused to run. Private Samuel Granger. Granger had stepped into open fire without hesitation, clutching an M60, holding the trail against an enemy ambush to buy time for the others. Nolan could still see it, the riverbank soaked with blood, screams echoing off the jungle, and Granger's defiance standing between life and death. 14 soldiers, including Nolan, had made it home because one kid refused to die in silence. He hadn't seen Granger since. The war scattered lives like ashes in the wind. Nolan looked down, startled to find he'd crushed his paper coffee cup in his grip. He tossed it aside and strode to the door. "Captain," he barked at his aide outside, voice sharp with urgency, "get me the duty roster. I want every name on Gate Bravo this morning, now." Minutes later, Cooper and Mendoza stood rigid before his desk, all the swagger gone from their faces. Their eyes darted nervously, pale under the weight of whatever was coming. "Do you have any idea," Nolan said, voice low and razor sharp, "who you humiliated this morning?" They shook their heads. Samuel Granger saved 14 American lives in Vietnam, including mine. Furious silence swallowed the room. I want his address, Nolan continued, and you better pray it's not too late to fix what you've just broken. He turned toward the phone without waiting for a reply. There were calls to make, serious ones. This wasn't about protocol. It was about debt, about respect, about a man forgotten by time, now owed something deeper than medals or salutes. Nolan would see it to it that Granger received the apology of a lifetime, delivered by the very man whose life he'd saved. Nolan's voice rang into the hallway before the door even opened. Get me the base operations officer now. Alert motor pool. I want 4 vehicles fueled and standing by within 20 minutes. Captain Holloway stepped in, a tablet in hand, eyes questioning. Sir, what's the... I don't have time to explain, Nolan snapped. Just follow orders. He turned back to the young soldiers, Cooper and Mendoza, their faces drained of color. The cockiness that had stained their voices earlier had vanished. Now they stood hollow, waiting. Do either of you understand what you've done? Gothard asked, his voice controlled but glacial. You mocked a man who held the line under fire, so that the rest of us could live. You laughed at the man who saved my life. Mendoza's lips parted, but no sound came. Nolan leaned in across the desk, his hands braced against the wood. He didn't ask for a parade. He didn't come here for medals. He came to leave behind a piece of his soul, and you treated him like garbage. The silence that followed was suffocating. Nolan straightened, eyes locked on the large wall map of Braddock Ridge. He raised a hand and pointed. I want a convoy ready to go to this address. 3 Humvees and an SUV. No sirens, no chatter, just presence. I want every neighbor on that street to know something important is happening. Captain Holloway scribbled notes, already moving. Samuel Granger had returned with humility and been met with ridicule. That was about to be corrected. With honor. Nolan raised an eyebrow, but his voice held steady. Sir, protocol. Protocol, Nolan cut in firmly, doesn't account for honor. His tone left no room for argument. That man stayed silent for 50 years. We will break that silence with respect. Within moments, the entire command wing snapped into action. Downstairs, the motor pool roared to life, diesel engines grumbling under the weight of olive drab hoods. 3 Humvees rolled into formation behind a black SUV marked with the insignia of the United States Army. Soldiers, still unsure of the reason for the sudden mobilization, climbed into passenger seats, casting uncertain glances at each other. All they knew was this wasn't a drill. And more strikingly, the general himself was leading it. Inside the office, Cooper and Mendoza stood at parade rest, their faces blank with disbelief. You're both coming with me, Nolan said as he pulled on his dress jacket, the fabric brushing crisply against the metals pinned to his chest. You will stand there and look that man in the eye. You will remember the expression on his face for the rest of your lives. Cooper swallowed hard. Yes, sir. Nolan turned to the mirror, straightened his collar, and paused for a moment to take in the framed photograph on his desk. A faded image of a younger version of himself, mud-splattered and weary, kneeling beside a wounded soldier in a jungle thicket. Granger. He stared at it, then walked out. The convoy rolled out through the main gates of Raven Hill, its engines rumbling like distant thunder. Traffic on the highway came to a stop. Honks faded, heads turned. A military procession this deliberate and somber drew attention. As the vehicles made their way into the quiet comfort of suburbia, curious onlookers watched through windows and doorways. On Maple Hollow Lane, residents stepped onto their porches, shielding their eyes against the afternoon glare. Children stopped riding their bikes. Phones were lifted to record the unfamiliar scene. At the very end of the street, inside a small white house with fading blue shutters, Samuel Granger rested in his recliner, eyes closed, unaware that the past was finally catching up to him, wearing brass buttons in solemn silence. Then came the knock, 3 sharp, deliberate raps that echoed across the decades like ghosts returning. Sam stirred. At first, he thought he'd dreamt it. But there it was again, firm, deliberate, unmistakably military. He pushed himself up with a groan, his body stiff from age, and shuffled slowly to the door. When he opened it, the moment swallowed the world around him whole. A man stood on his porch, tall and unmoving, clad in a full army dress uniform. His boots were polished to a mirror shine. A cap rested under one arm. Ribbons and medals gleamed on his chest, catching the sunlight. But it was his eyes that struck Sam. Those eyes, etched deep with memory, hadn't changed. Not even time could erase a soldier's eyes. Behind him, the black SUV and 3 Humvees idled softly along the curb. Neighbors had gathered, whispering and filming, stunned into stillness. Even the soldiers, normally pillars of resolve, looked unsure, diminished by something they didn't fully understand. The general raised his right hand in a slow, reverent salute, the kind earned in blood, not ceremony. Sam blinked, breath caught. His lips parted slightly, his hand tightening around the doorframe to steady the tremble in his fingers. "It's you," he said, voice barely a whisper. "You lived." The general lowered his salute and stepped forward. "Because of you, Sam," he answered, his voice deep but full of gratitude. "I've worn this uniform for 50 years, trying every day to be worthy of what you did for me." Sam's knees nearly gave out, but he stood his ground. His eyes locked on the man who now bore 4 stars on his shoulder, but once had been a bleeding, terrified young captain he dragged through jungle mud during a firefight no one believed they'd survive. That captain had become General Nolan. Sam's eyes flicked past Nolan briefly and noticed 2 soldiers standing behind him. The younger one, Cooper, looked pale and tight-lipped. Mendoza stood stiffly, avoiding Sam's gaze. Nolan caught it. "They're here to learn something today," he said gently. "Something I should have taught them long ago." Sam's focus never wavered from Nolan's face. "You remember everything?" he asked, voice gritty with age and memory. "Every second," Nolan replied. "I remember standing there thinking I'd never see my wife again. And then, there you were, not flinching, just doing what had to be done." Sam took a slow breath, his voice rasped from his throat. "You were the one I pulled out. You saved me, Sam. You saved 14 of us that day. I've owed you everything ever since." The 2 men stood still, surrounded by silence so thick it pressed in from every direction. Time seemed to pause, folding that long-ago battlefield into the quiet of a suburban lawn. And then, finally, Sam hesitated for just a heartbeat before accepting the extended hand, not a handshake in formality, but an offering of respect. The grip was firm, steady, warm, undeniably real. "Forgive what happened at the gate," Nolan said, his tone steady yet remorseful. "They didn't know who you were, but I do." Sam's eyes drifted beyond Nolan to the convoy still idling outside. Uniformed figures stood with silent reverence. Neighbors peeked from porches and driveways. This is a lot," Sam murmured, voice catching in his throat. "You deserve more," Nolan replied without hesitation. "But this is a start." Sam nodded, slowly stepping away from the doorway. "Come on in. It's not much, but it is home." Nolan crossed the threshold quietly, respectfully. Behind him, Cooper and Mendoza lingered on the porch, unmoving. They hadn't been invited in yet. That would come in time, but only after an apology, after understanding. After 2 generations of soldiers stood face to face with history, with a forgotten man who had carried more than most could bear. For the first time in decades, Sam Granger didn't feel misplaced or invisible. He felt acknowledged, seen. The living room was modest but warm. The scent of aged timber and time-worn memories hung gently in the air. Sam walked slowly to the coffee table, carefully placing the folded American flag down with reverence. Then he eased himself into the recliner opposite General Nolan. Silence fell between them, not awkward but meaningful. Outside, neighbors remained on their porches. The Humvees and SUVs still idled, standing like silent sentries. Nolan turned slightly and called over his shoulder, "Cooper, Mendoza." The 2 young soldiers stepped in, heads lowered, hats in their hands. Their backs were straight, but their eyes betrayed their discomfort, the kind born not of fear but of regret. Sam studied them. His gaze, weathered by years in combat, was calm but unwavering. He saw their shame clearly. It wasn't for show. Cooper cleared his throat. "Sir, Sergeant Granger, I want to apologize. I didn't know who you were. That doesn't excuse anything. I was wrong, deeply wrong." Mendoza stepped forward, voice cracking. We treated you like you didn't matter. We didn't even listen. And we were supposed to be the ones protecting the honor of men like you. We failed. Sam looked at them, really looked. To him now, they were just boys. He saw ghosts of the young soldiers he once knew, who had marched into war thinking they understood its weight, until the chaos arrived in fire and thunder. You did what you thought was right in the moment, Sam said, his voice low and steady. That matters more than you know. But listen carefully. Every man carries scars, some you see, some you don't. Always remember that. He paused, holding their eyes. You looked at me and saw someone worn out, disposable. But I've worn this coat longer than you've worn boots. Neither soldier flinched. They stood straight or humbled, no longer armored in pride. General Nolan stood. I didn't bring them just to apologize, Sam, he said quietly. I brought them to witness, to understand the weight of service in silence. He looked to the young men again. This man saved lives. He carried that burden alone for decades. What you saw today wasn't weakness. It was courage. Sam reached for the folded flag and a medal on the side table. He held them for a moment, then offered them to Nolan. I came to the gate to give these away, Sam said. I thought maybe someone younger could carry them forward. Nolan took them gently, reverently, and then placed them right back into Sam's lap. Let me suggest something else. Outside, soldiers began stepping from the Humvees. One by one, they moved into formation across Sam's small front yard. Word had spread. Neighbors inched closer, watching in respectful silence. You'll be our guest of honor, Nolan said. Next week, Veterans Day, full ceremony, and these two, he nodded at Cooper and Mendoza, will lead the honor guard. Sam looked down at the foy ink resting in his hands. For once, they were steady. All right, General, he said, a quiet smile forming. Let's give the boys a history lesson they'll never forget. The morning of Veterans Day dawned sharp and cold. A thin glaze of frost shimmered across the grass at Raven Hill Training Center, glittering beneath the rising sun. Folding chairs filled the courtyard, occupied by soldiers, officers, veterans, and local townspeople from all across the county. American flags fluttered from every post. A brass quintet played softly in the background, the music solemn and beautiful, setting the tone for a day that would honor more than just one man. It would honor a forgotten legacy, reborn. Notes whispered through the air like a prayer. In the front row, Private Cooper and Private Mendoza sat straight-backed in pristine uniforms. Their eyes held a blend of anticipation and quiet reverence. A low murmur began to ripple through the courtyard. At the far end, Samuel Granger emerged. He moved slowly with no cane, no help, just quiet strength. His shoulders were square, his chin lifted with quiet dignity. He wore a dark suit, the very one he'd worn decades ago when he married Betty. In his hands, cradled with the care one might show to sacred relics, were a folded flag and a bronze star. As he approached the podium, the entire crowd stood in solemn silence. General Nolan stepped forward, offering Sam a hand to steady him as he climbed the steps. No words passed between them, but in their eyes, mutual respect flowed, silent and unbreakable. Sam turned toward the microphone. His voice, gravelly with age, still carried strength. I didn't come here looking for recognition, he began. I came to honor the men who never came back, the names I still whisper when no one's around to hear. He lifted the flag slightly, gazing down at it. This flag has sat in my closet for 50 years. Every time I looked at it, I saw faces, my brothers, my friends, the ones who gave everything. I used to wonder if the world had forgotten them, if it had moved on too far to remember. The courtyard fell completely still. Every breath was held. But last week, he continued, his voice softening, I realized that memory isn't just something we hold on to. It's something we pass on, not with medals, not with parades, but with understanding, with humility, with moments like this. He stepped forward and placed the flag into General Nolan's hands. Nolan accepted it with a full ceremonial reverence, his movements slow and deliberate. Cooper and Mendoza rose and joined the honor guard on stage. They stood straighter now, eyes no longer just wide with admiration, but carrying something deeper, a knowledge of what true service means. As Sam stepped back, the silence broke into a thunderous standing ovation. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Samuel Granger no longer felt like a forgotten soldier. He felt seen. He felt whole. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, soft and slow, a silent benediction from the sky. In the weeks that followed the Veterans Day ceremony, the echo of that moment didn't fade. It rippled outward. Cooper and Mendoza, once just two young men drifting through duty, were no longer the same. They requested transfers to Raven Hill's Honor Guard Division, not for recognition, not for advancement, but because they had found something worth standing for. Week after week, they showed up. At memorials, at flag ceremonies, at funerals. Every time they stood tall, they carried with them the quiet imprint of Samuel Granger's story. Not memorized, not recited, but lived. A memory woven into their very being, a lesson earned, not taught. Across town, in a small room at the local VFW, Sam found a new rhythm to his days. He didn't speak much. Most of the young vets who walked through that door weren't looking for speeches. What they needed was someone who understood the silence between words. Someone who knew how it felt to come home and find yourself a stranger to your own world. Sam listened. Sometimes he shared advice. Other times, he just sat beside them, offering nothing but quiet company. Slowly, the weight he had carried alone for decades began to shift, lifted, piece by piece, by the hands of those who understood. Pain divided as pain softened. Grief shared is the first step to healing. Every Sunday, Cooper and Mendoza came by. They called him Sergeant now, not out of protocol, but from a place of genuine respect. They brought coffee, sometimes pie, often questions, and Sam would greet them with a warmth that no longer carried bitterness. Just peace at night. After everyone had gone and silence returned like an old companion, Sam would settle into his recliner by the window. The folded flag now rested in a display case on the wall. Beside it, a small plaque General Nolan had crafted, engraved with the words, "Courage unspoken, lives saved in silence." And there, too, was a photo of Betty, still smiling. One evening, as the wind stirred the bare trees outside, Sam sat wrapped in a blanket, a half-finished crossword on the table beside him. He glanced at Betty's photo and let out a soft laugh. Took me long enough, didn't it? Then he leaned back, his eyes calm, his heart light, and for the first time in decades, Samuel Granger smiled. Not for the world, not for the crowd, just for himself. He wasn't seeking recognition. He wasn't chasing applause. He had simply come home. In a world that spins faster with every passing year, where headlines change by the hour and voices fight to be the loudest, it's far too easy to overlook the quiet heroes. The ones who asked for nothing. The ones who returned from war and never spoke much about it. The ones who rebuilt their lives without ever needing the world to watch. Men like Samuel Granger stand as silent reminders. Reminders that true dignity doesn't demand a spotlight. It simply endures. That real honor isn't something you wear. It's something you carry every single day. This story isn't only about military service. It's deeper than that. It's about how we see each other, or more accurately, how often we fail to. How often do we dismiss someone because of the lines on their face or the slowness of their step? How quickly do we assume they have nothing left to give, nothing of value left to say, and how deeply wrong we can be? That mistake of judging without knowing can be quietly devastating, because behind every set of tired eyes, especially those of our elders, there may be a lifetime of sacrifice, of grief, of stories untold. Maybe that's what this divided world of ours truly needs. Not more opinions shouted into the void, but more moments of listening, honest human listening. So ask yourself, have you ever looked at someone and made assumptions, only to learn later how wrong you were? Do we, as a society, really do enough for our veterans? Not just through ceremonies or medals, but through empathy, through really seeing them? I'd truly love to hear what you think. Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me about your parents or that neighbor who always keeps to himself, or the old man who walks alone every morning down your street. Maybe he's more than just a face in the background. If this story touched something in you, if Samuel reminded you of someone you miss or someone you're lucky to still have, please take a moment to like the video. It helps others find these stories, the ones that matter. And if you believe in the power of these quiet truths, subscribe so you won't miss the next one. We've got more to tell, more real human stories that remind us not just who we were, but who we still can be. To every veteran, every elder, and every quiet soul still carrying the unseen weight of yesterday, thank you. You are seen, you are remembered, and you always will be. Until next time, take care of one another and listen closely, because sometimes the softest voices hold the deepest truths.